Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Ted Gibson, who is Professor of Cognitive Sciences at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Gibson's research examines how language is processed and how language processing constrains language structure. Welcome, Ted.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. I want to start with one of your papers entitled How Efficiency Shapes Human Language, in which you say cognitive science applies diverse tools and perspectives to study human language. Recently, an exciting body of work has examined linguistic phenomena through the lens of efficiency in usage. What otherwise puzzling features of language find explanation in formal accounts, and how language might be optimized for communication and learning. This is a very interesting area for me. I know nothing about languages per se, but involved a little bit of computer languages, and often wondered, and I grew up in South India with a completely different language when I was growing up, and then came to the U.S., picked up English, and these languages are completely different, and the complexity is also quite different. So I often wondered how language evolved. Just to set the context, Ed, how many languages do you have? Something like 6,000 worldwide?
Depending on how you count, different typologists will say that something between 6,000 to 7,000 different languages. It's hard to say what counts as a language exactly, because there's a lot of closely related dialects, languages, which might be counted as languages or might not be counted as separate languages. But there's on the order of 7,000 from at least 150 to 200 distinct families, where across those families, we see no connections. There's no historical connection whatsoever between any of those. Of course, there probably is some connection between those, but it's just further back than we can measure. So there's no measurable connection between any of them. There's no historical connection between those 150, 200, and there's no measurable connection in terms of the words that they currently use or the forms they currently use, which are related at all. So there's a lot of variability around the world's languages.
So 200 or so sort of templates that humans seem to have used to construct these. But if we look at it mathematically, do we find any sort of structural similarities at all, or they look completely different?
Well, first of all, when I say there's around 200 of these families, we keep in mind that one of those families is something called Indo-European, and so the languages that within that family, we just understand how they're all connected more historically, and so those include languages like probably your native languages. I don't know if that's Hindi or if it's what is your native language? Is it?
So mine is a Dravidian language called Malayalam, which is a combination of Sanskrit and Tamil. And Sanskrit, I think, would be in the
Right.
Indo-European lineage there. I think Sanskrit and German share a lot of commonality,
Uh-huh.
I
Uh-huh.
think.
So there's, but I'm just my point was going to be that even though they may be in the same family, there's an enormous amount of variability within a single family. So Indo-European includes Hindi, includes obviously includes all the Germanic languages, including German, and includes the Romance languages. It includes includes an enormous variability in there. And there's like I don't know how many Indo-European languages there are, but on the order of 100. And they're very those are related languages at some level, and some are closer than others. So of course, languages like Spanish and Portuguese are pretty close, and English and German are actually reasonably close, and German and Dutch are even closer. But it seems like the languages actually in mainland India are kind of a little further away, but they're still within the same family. And even so, there's a few thousand languages all around the world, and from around 200 of these families, which holds a lot of variability. Now, your question was, are they all arbitrarily different? The answer is, almost certainly no. There's a lot of similarities in certain ways across languages, and we've been my group has been exploring that, and many people actually now, many researchers in the last 15 years, 10, 15 years have been exploring that the similarity across languages through the lens of information theory. And so we look at, well, first of all, I should say what language is. Maybe it might help to talk about what human languages are. First of all, there's when you learn a new language, you have to learn a bunch of sounds. Those are called the so-called phonemes of a language. And you have to then learn how to put those phonemes together to make things like words. Actually, we prefer to call them morphemes in linguistics, but let's just think of those as words because it's sort of easiest in English, because words and morphemes are almost the same in English. They're just sort of the minimal units which have meaning. So the word cat is the minimal way to talk about something in the world, that a thing, a cat, which has three little pieces, the k, the a, and the t. You can think of it as the letters, but it's not, the spelling sound correspondence isn't exactly perfect in English, but it's not terrible. And there's no way that the meaning of cat comes from the meaning of k plus the meaning of a plus the meaning of t. It's pretty independent of those things. It's not entirely independent. There is some variability. So there's some sounds which tend to go with some meanings a little bit more, but it's a very small correlation. So mostly that's just completely independent. And so we're looking at, and so then we've got the sounds of the world, and then world's languages, and then you have these words in a world's language, and then you have how you put those words together, and that's the so-called syntax of the world's languages. And when I say syntax, what I mean is just any compositionality of how you put together those basic units, the morphemes or the words, and you form something bigger. And so whenever you put two things together, there's a form, how you put them together. So I say the cat, I put the together with cat, and now I'm talking about I guess a particular cat in the context, and then there's a meaning associated with that. And for any of these forms, there's a form meaning correspondence, and so so for any syntax, there's a meaning associated with how you put those two together. And we look for, and me and other people, lots of other people around, and researchers in psychology, computer science, and linguistics programs are trying to understand how similar and how different languages are in terms of the words that they have and the combinations of words that they have. And there's a lot of overlap, it turns out. There's a lot of ways in which all languages are the same. There probably is actually a lot at the sound base as well. I just don't happen to work on that, and so that's so I happen to work on the meaning parts more than the sound bits. And so there are generalizations across the world's languages also in terms of the kinds of sounds that tend to occur in human languages. But that's not my expertise. The other parts, the meaning things, are the things I have more expertise.
So do we have a crisp definition of language that, so, in computer languages, high-level languages are used to essentially let humans create an assembly-level instruction set for the computer. So, it's sort of a translator. Um, do we have a crisp definition? But what do we mean by human language?
Well, a human language is just a human communication system. That's it. And so, so whatever it is, that humans use to communicate with other humans, that is their language, and that doesn't have to be auditory. So there are sign languages for people that are deaf, and so they have, like, it may take a very different form, and that becomes kind of interesting when these sign languages are just evolving, and because maybe kids it turns out that some small proportion of hearing parents give birth to deaf children, and they have to somehow communicate, and so they may sort of invent a sign language among themselves, the child and the parents, in order to communicate. So that's probably a very rudimentary language still, because there's a set of words in that dictionary, whatever that it may be, very simple, maybe very simplified. These are called sort of home sign languages, and because the parents may not have any way of communicating with their kid auditorily, so they can't teach them, say, English. If me and my partner have a child and the child is deaf, we can't use English to communicate with them, so then we have to somehow make up our own communication system, and that's a language. It's just a probably less powerful language in that it may not be as easy to express everything that we want to express, because we have to invent it ourselves to do that. But that's still a language, so we, I guess from our purposes, we're just interested in any naturally evolving human language of any kind, and trying to understand what the commonalities of those are for human communication. I mean, I'm taking that as a given in some ways, because that's kind of the most obvious thing to think about what human language might be for. Why do we have human language? The most obvious thing to say, it's easy to say that to a computer scientist, is I'm a computer scientist myself, is like, that seems to be the obvious thing that it might be for, is for talking to someone else. That's not the only idea as to what the sort of value of a human language might be. So the famous linguist Noam Chomsky has hypothesized that language evolved in order to think, as opposed to in order to communicate with others, and those might be related in some sense. So maybe it's like kind of talk to yourself as opposed to talk to someone else, but those aren't the same idea. And I think a very simple hypothesis to start with is maybe it's for talking to others, to communicate with others.
Yeah, so communication is a big aspect. I think language as a thinking vehicle is actually quite interesting. Would we say animals have language, or it doesn't?
Yeah, sure they do. Yes, they do. It's just a simplified communication system. So yes, absolutely. The definition of obviously human language is just languages that humans use, and then an animal language is an animal communication system, is one that humans use, that animals use, whatever the species is, to communicate among themselves. They're going to be simplified. They're going to be much more simple than human languages, because they won't be able to express the same range of concepts that humans can express, but they can certainly. Different kinds of monkeys have different kinds of calls depending on to express to each other. So there are, just distress calls versus food calls to tell their members of their community, different information that's important to them. But they can't do, a claim in the literature has been that, human languages may be different from animal communication systems, in that human languages are compositional, so that you can put together two separate morphemes, words, and make a more complex meaning, which doesn't happen very much in the animal communication world. That's not strictly true. I mean, even bees have a complicated dance that they do to explain to other bees where to find flowers that are useful for them, to making their honey, and so they do a complicated dance, which is clearly compositional. It tells how far away, what direction, and how far away the flowers are, and so that is compositional, but it's very narrow. So it's actually pretty hard to come up with a definition of the kinds of things that a human language can do that a non-human language can't do. I think really it just comes down to there's just much more, whatever there's in any animal communication system, there's just much more of it in a human system. There's another claim that's out there is due to Noam Chomsky, is that maybe human languages are the ones that are recursive. They're not just compositional, but they make rules that call themselves, and so you can get arbitrarily long and single, basically sentences, single utterances. That's a claim from Chomsky, which is actually, it's unclear what he meant when he said that, and so that's been a source of discussion in the linguistics literature for the last 20 years. So it's like he wrote a paper in 2002, which people argue about ever since, and it's not really clear what he meant actually by the word recursion in that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. So I want to just push on this idea of simplicity. So you could look at it sort of the ability of a language to provide information, perhaps the breadth of ideas, breadth of information. The more it can do, the more complex it's going to be. In general, do we find languages getting more complex? If there's an evolution of a single language, let's say English, do you think it's getting more complex, or is it getting more simple over time?
That's a really interesting question, and the answer is we don't know. But let's put some definitions out there. So what I mean by complexity, when I say, if I were to say that a language is more complicated, say one than another, all I would mean by that, it's very simple, would be that it would have more words and more rules. So maybe a little more subtle than that. Okay, so that's like a simple definition. So so English, a typical English speaker, a literate English speaker in the United States, for example, one who went to college, will have a vocabulary of something like 50,000 different lexical items, different words. It sounds like a lot. It actually is quite a lot. And a lot of that actually comes from reading. So maybe when a child of 10 is around 10, they have a much smaller vocabulary, but from a lot of reading over the following years, they build a vocabulary of something like 50,000 or maybe even 100,000 different lexical items. It's actually not too hard it seems like an awful lot, but that's how many words there's many, many more words than that in a big dictionary, in a big Oxford English dictionary. There are many words. There's hundreds of thousands of words in there, and many, you may know many of those. People who are very literate, who read a lot, will know a lot of those. And they're very, even though there are so many, I should point out there's a probability distribution over those words. And so they vary on the order of at least 6 orders of magnitude, meaning the most common word will be, 100 million more times more common than the least frequent word, at least that. So the distribution is very probabilistic, such that the words that we typically use are extremely frequent, and the words that we may know lots and lots and lots of words in this so-called tail, the long tail of the distribution, but there's just maybe tens of thousands of those, but they hardly ever get used. So so that'll be true across people, no matter what the distribution is. That there's a distribution like that in everyone's dictionary. The extent of the tail will be the thing that's varying across people. How many low frequency words do you know, as opposed to the most common ones everyone will know. And so things down to the things that only occur once in a million, most people will know, almost everyone will know. But the ones that occur once every 100 million are going to be very variable. And the same thing is true for the rules. Okay, for the syntactic rules, the way that we put things together, there's going to be ways that people talk, or write, which is more and less frequent than others. I mean, I'm not actually sure about the distribution of that, whether it's if it's identical in shape to the word one. The word one's easy to study because words or morphemes are we write these things down and we can find them in big texts. But the rules of how you put them together, what the syntactic rules are, becomes theoretically loaded, and so different theories do different things for how they decide to put things together, and so that is not so easy. That's why it's a little hard to know exactly how many ways there are to put things together, because then we have to make a decision for every one of those as to, like, some theoretist has to decide what the simplest, or if that's how we're going to decide, what's the simplest way to do all that. But there's going to be tens of thousands of those that we know also. Maybe something on that order, maybe on the order of not millions probably, but tens of thousands. I think that's what we kind of think there. And so then your question is, are there are there languages with more words and fewer words, and are languages with more syntactic rules and fewer syntactic rules? And I mean, sort of, yes, but then the question really becomes, do the typical speakers in each one of those languages, what do they know in each one of those? And we just don't know the answer to that. And frankly, it's been politically, it's not that's kind of a dangerous, you're heading into dangerous territory there if you happen to say that some language is simpler or more complicated than some others. There's a sort of a mantra in anthropology that no culture, no language is more simple or more difficult, that more complicated than any other, and that's kind of a so we don't want to we got to be careful there about saying that some groups of people, if they speak some language, are simpler than others, depending on what kinds of inferences other people may make about what that may mean. And so it's kind of a touchy subject for some people. And so that's not something that's been heavily explored, to be frank. But also because it's hard. It's actually kind of a hard question to explore because of the theoretical loadedness of finding out what the grammar is in any one of those languages exactly.
Yeah, I was not looking at cross-sectionally, but longitudinally. So I have noticed this phenomenon, Ted, that the place I grew up in India, last 30 years, I visit that place maybe once every 2 years or so. Every time I go, I feel like, and this is a phenomenon I have been noticing for 20, 25 years now, the number of words that are used in conversation seem to decline with time. And so the number of words that people used to use 25 years ago, the total number is substantially more than what they currently do. In other words, you could look at it two ways. You could say they're able to communicate with less words and tremendously more context, in the sense that a word is basically becoming a stand-in for 15 different ideas now, and you would only know it if you know the context. And I don't know if this phenomenon is sort of universal if you look at other languages, but I do notice it in this specific instance.
I'm not aware of any. Well, first of all, I'm not aware of any longitudinal sort of study of language use which shows that that usage of a volume of words is changing in some interesting way. And so you're saying that it's going down over some period here. Is it possible that there may be other words that, I don't know. I mean, that's a sort of a common complaint that, I hate to tell you this, that sort of older people say about younger people, that they talk more simply than we used to. And it's really just, usually it's the case that it's just different, that things are changing and things are changing. Maybe the syntax has changed a little bit in some interesting way, and the words they use may be slightly different, but it's not clear that it's actually any more complicated or simple than what was going on, whatever at any time frame. I'm not familiar with any study which has shown that a set of words gets that the set of words that's being used is shrinking over time in any population. How would you do that now? How would you study that? One way to study that would be with texting, for instance. I mean, because it provides enormous recorded databases, basically, of how people communicate with one another. But maybe, but at least it would give you 2 time points, and you give a point from 10 years ago to now, and you could see how the usage changes over that period. The problem with, your observation, if it's a true observation, is how do you need some way of naturally measuring that over all this period, and so then you'd need at least then recorded conversations or something which would have to be transcribed. Transcription isn't so hard these days. We can do a lot of that kind of automatically, but you'd have to have sort of natural conversations automatically transcribed and then evaluated. And I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. It may very well happen. I may go the other direction sometimes, and we may not know why these things happen yet. So I'm not familiar with longitudinal shrinking of vocabulary in a population as a thing that happens typically.
I wasn't suggesting it's getting simpler. So that frequency distribution that you talked about, there seems to be a trend toward the higher frequency words to be even higher frequency over time, and lower frequency words to be even lower frequency over time. The implication of that is to communicate the same amount of information, you have to use a lot more context, because you're basically using the same words over and over again in different contexts, which would imply that for somebody to pick up the language now, it's really, really complex. It's you have to. It's not just studying language; it's studying culture, really, before you can pick up the language.
I'm not. Even if that's a different claim, I agree. But I'm not. I'm not aware of any longitudinal study of that, which is a little harder to study, right? So that's what you're saying is that the claim is that we have this, some same set of words. So the set of words doesn't change, but the meanings of the words, some of these high frequency words get used in more different meanings. So basically, there's invention of meanings associated with high frequency words. There's some, there's a maybe a usefulness for doing that we don't have to learn a new form. I can just keep using the same form. But you're right, there's a complexity associated with that, which is now I have to have multiple meanings more multiple meanings associated with the same form. I should just point out that all languages have that, have some form of that. So in English, the high frequency words do tend to be more ambiguous. There's a lot of so-called homophony and synonymy in I guess homophony here is the most important thing here. Polysemy and homophony are these are technical terms. One of them is just that if you I have multiple meanings associated with the same string, and so a word like two in English can mean either the number two, TWO. We write it differently, but this is the right venue for transmitting it. It sounds the same as if it's a preposition as well. So I gave a book to Mary. They pronounce the same way, kind of. And then there's also this word, TOO we write, which means also. And there's actually another TO, which is an inflection marker, which is a really different kind of a function word than the preposition. So I gave a book to Mary as one. I want to sleep is a different. Those are actually different forms, different morphemes. They just look the same, sound the same in English. And so in English is not different from any other language. All languages are like this, that very high frequency short forms tend to be ambiguous, tend to have a bunch of different meanings. And then there's also this thing called polysemy, where very closely related words have the same form. So a word like cap can mean something I wear in my head. It also can mean the top of a pen. Those are kind of closely related, but they're not exactly the same meaning. And again, very short, frequent words tend to have more of those. And so maybe that's true in all human languages. I mean, we think that's been explored in around, I don't know, 15 so far, and that's there's a strong relationship between there. It's true in all those languages. We know that homophony, these things exist in all languages, but then there's an interesting observation that it tends to occur more in the shorter, more frequent words. There's a relationship between, so that's one of these generalizations. Right. You asked me at the very beginning, what are things that are true across all human languages? Well, one of them is an observation due to this guy Zipf. He's a linguist from Harvard from the 30s and 40s. And he observed that high frequency words in every language tend to be short, and that's true in every human language. And here we can say something a little bit more than that. We can say that the very frequent short things also tend to be more ambiguous than the longer things. And that's a neat generalization, which probably is helpful in communication. So in that you're kind of pointing out, your observation there is that you need, if you get a word like, say, two's a nice example in English, you need the context to know how to interpret that. But it helps. Maybe it helps learners here. It helps speakers to not have to say so much, not have to hear so much. If I can use the short, if I can basically say less to get across the same point, so I can reuse those short things over and over again. That makes it easier for me as a speaker, as a lazy person. I think of myself, and maybe all humans, as sort of inherently lazy, in that I'm trying to, not really lazy, but I'm trying to optimize, make things easy, so I can do more maybe with the rest of my time in some way. And so that the language may be like that.
So that's what you talk about in the paper too. So you call it communicative efficiency. And there are different aspects of efficiency, right? Obviously, the shorter words might be easier. And I was wondering, Ted, it might be easier to say, but do we have any measure of sort of the cognitive cost in any way to words? Is it
so you're like
this,
so when we're talking about
cost?
Just to be clear here, you mean there's like in any language utterance experience, there's me, this producer, and then there's you, the listener. So so you're talking about on the listener side then, or the comprehender, say if it's writing, if whatever the comprehension production side, there's me, there's something that's easy for me to say, and there's something that's easy for me to read or to hear, to understand. And so are you talking about how we see cognitive cost? Because there's a cognitive cost to production,
both, right?
And there's a cognitive cost to comprehension. And so both of those are relevant, presumably, in efficiency, in deciding what makes something easy in some sense to deal with as in a communication system. So I sort of interpret you as saying, are you asking, is there a cognitive cost in understanding these things? Is that right?
No, I would say both, right? So if I am the sender of information, it is futile for me to just optimize cognitive cost on my end, because I might end up repeating it.
Well, absolutely, that's right. So you need something to be right. It's so the extreme case of easy for the speaker is just having one word for everything. So if I just say it's super easy for me to say that, but there's no communication happening because there's no way to, it's very, very difficult. Maybe there's something about the length or something about how I'm saying those things that is corresponding to the meanings in some way or other, but it's so difficult to decode that it's not a very good communication system. So it's helpful to have distinguishable sounds in our communication system. It's helpful to have distinguishable words in our communication system. And so I think that's the extreme case of what you were saying there. So yes, of course, we need to have it. But what was your question then? If it wasn't when you say cognitive cost, I didn't understand what that.
Yeah, so you use some parameters in the paper, such as word length, association, ambiguity, and so on. And this is something that you can measure at the word level or at the syntax level. I was wondering. I don't think this has been done. I was just wondering if we have any sort of neuroscience measurement. Suppose I have a hypothesis that says, shorter words and shorter length between associated words is easier, is simpler. What I was asking was, do we have any neuroscience measurement that says it's actually less cognitively costly to produce
Kind
as
of.
well?
So neural is pushing it,
Yeah.
but certainly behavioral. So in behavioral measures, there's a bunch of different behavioral measures one can use to evaluate things like cognitive cost. So and those could be either I mean, most of those are in comprehension. So just for instance, there's like the most simple version is you can just ask people. So ask people, not one person, but ask a bunch of people to do ratings of how complicated they think things are. So how easy they are, how easy, this is like the standard method actually in linguistics is what are called acceptability measures. So in the field of syntax and semantics, people use this measurement, which is just basically asking sort of random speakers of a language whether this is a possible string or not, and with this meaning. And so that's an acceptability judgment, and you can fine tune that so it's not just is it thumbs up, thumbs down, good or bad, just how good is it on a scale of whatever, very terrible to really great, and then you can get a cognitive measure there of an utterance or of a word or anything you want. Okay, so that's a very simple measure. Then we can correlate that, for instance, with in say reading. It's harder in listening, but in reading we can get a measure of how complicated a sentence is in two measures, basically how fast you read that sentence and how well you answer comprehension questions about that sentence. And so if you have to answer comprehension questions about something, then you read it carefully, relatively carefully, depending on what the questions are. If you've ever done any kind of standardized tests, that depending on what the questions are, you read at different levels of detail to try to understand what it is you're being tested on at the end. But say you're being tested pretty carefully about the content of sentences, then people will read it at whatever rate that is for themselves, and that rate will change depending on the complexity of the sentence. So people will read slower for more complicated parts of sentences, for example. It's a very rough measure, frankly, because there's it's a loose relationship between the reading time and the complexity. I think actually, even though the other measure I mentioned, which is just an intuitive complexity measure, just asking you how complicated something is, I think that was actually better in some sense, because you may read a very complicated sentence fast and know it's complicated and just not be able to know what it's about and just say okay, and then so that relationship isn't great, and you might be very, very sensitive to how complicated it is and just not be able to understand it, and therefore read it. So that but anyway, one of the measures is just sort of reading time. That's a measure that people use to try to understand the sort of language complexity in some way. Reading time is an indirect measure, I think, of something like your intuitive complexity. Now, when you go into the brain, there are, the problem with, I can talk at length about this. Our understanding of how language is implemented in the brain is only now in the last 5-10 years being really kind of starting to be well understood. And so we don't have the greatest measures right now of sort of complexity neural measures right now, but that's a lot of that's because there's this, basically the brain's a black box in a way. We're trying to figuring out how language is implemented in the brain has been a complicated research problem for the last 100 years, 150 years, and really only the last 10 years have we got a lot of headway there. And the problem there is in getting good neural signatures is that we don't have the best measures of what's going on in a human brain while it's happening. The best measure of what's going on in a human brain while it's happening is functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is kind of terrible in some sense because it's measuring blood flow. It's measuring blood flow. And so it basically relies on the idea that, when you think harder about something, blood goes there. Okay. So in that area of the brain. So if I start showing you a bunch of faces, for example, blood flows to the area of your brain which processes faces. And so there's something called the fusiform face area. It's in the cortex where you process faces specially over anything else, basically. And the measure there is blood flow. And so there's increased blood flow to that area over time, but that takes 2 seconds or something, around 2 seconds for the blood to get to an area. And so there might be immediate neural stuff going on, but the blood doesn't get there for another 2 seconds. And so it's a very noisy measure of what's going on in the process that we're doing right now. Me producing and you listening. I talk fast. I kind of know I talk fast. So there's a lot of stuff going on in my brain producing language. Within 2 seconds, there's so much stuff that happens, and there's so much stuff that's happening in your brain, in that period as well. And so, language is tough. Has been tough to, from that perspective, to use this measure, fMRI, because it's using this, 2 second. It takes this 2 second window for the blood to get anywhere, to get to a useful place. And then there's all these complicated other reasons why in that our brains, my brain and your brain, aren't the same. They're similar. Like they're about as similar. I actually don't know what you look like. I don't know if you know what I look like, but my face is like many other human faces in that the orientation of my eyes is above my nose and it's above my, those are above my mouth and so on. But the relative orientations of those things, how far apart they are, how far apart my eyes are, how big my face is, where my eyes are relative to my forehead, these things are all different, right? And like mine will be different from yours, will be different from everyone else. And the insides of our heads are similar in that way, in that they're also individually different. And so finding out from this rough measure how language is implemented, it turns out to be quite difficult because how do we look inside? We can basically do some 3D imaging and see inside my brain and see inside your brain with fMRI, but deciding which parts are the areas that process language and which are in mine versus yours is actually a complicated problem. And it turns out what we have to do is localize language in me first and localize language in you first and figure out which network of regions is active when I'm listening or processing language, and then look at that region and compare that to yours. And that turns out to be, so that's why it's been kind of a slow process, is figuring all this out for in the last only 10 years that stuff has been going on.
Yeah, we'll take a quick break, Ted. When we come back, we'll talk more about the evolution of languages. Thank you.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.
So we're back. Ted, we were talking about human languages, how they're designed, what the purpose is, and really how they differ across the world as well. One of the hypotheses that you have in the paper is about how the human language is designed from an efficiency perspective, and there are various parameters that you're exploring here. And one of them is word length. And you talked a bit about this. George Siff, who had a hypothesis earlier on about this. Do you want to elaborate a bit more on word length, and do we have sufficient information from, I know that you have done research in a few languages. Do they all point to sort of the same idea about word length?
Yes, and so this I mentioned earlier is this guy George Kingsley Ziff. I like his middle name, Kingsley. He's a was a linguist at Harvard in the 40s, and he had proposed that um, word length were correlated. I mean, it's a kind of an obvious idea, frankly, and the idea is to make it easier for you, the speaker, and for you, the listener, to hear less and say less to get the same amount of information across. Basically, it's easy. The idea is that I want to make words that I say all the time really short, and I don't want to. And words that I hardly ever have to say, they can be arbitrarily long, or they can still be short. But critically, the ones that I say all the time should be short. And so he explored that in a few languages, but of course it was back in the 30s and in the 40s, and back then there weren't big corpora, big texts available from many languages, and so but even so, when I had a student from a few years ago, a guy called Steve Pantadosi, he noticed that even so, there are lots of exceptions. I mean, there's going to be exceptions to the generalization that I tell you in a second, but there's still a lot of exceptions of very short words, which are very infrequent. Okay, and so there, it's kind of weird that you get these very infrequent short words. Words like let me see, like yonder, for example, or a word like give another one here. A word like aback is a very short word, and yet it's extremely low frequency. It hardly ever gets used in English. But what Steve noticed was that these words, even though they're very short, they occur in very predictable circumstances. Meaning, a word like aback, it only basically gets used in a context immediately following the verb to be taken aback by something. Basically, it's the only time that ever occurs, pretty much. And same with yonder, it only occurs basically after prepositions like over. I don't even know if it occurs after. I think there's some other environments, but there's hardly anything for either of them. And so the idea of Steve's idea was like, look, you could have low frequency for so you could have very short words because they're highly frequent, independent of context, or they could be very short if they are frequent, sort of predictable in the current context. And so what he did was look at, instead of just looking at frequency independent of context, let's look at frequency given the context. That's basically predictability. And so predictability, we just look at basically the probabilities, or we just look at the log of the probability, which is this appraisal measure, the negative log probability of a word given its previous context or following context. Doesn't matter which direction we're looking at here, but let's say preceding context, look at the two words, and then the third word, how often that third word occurs in the context of all. We'll see what the distribution of contexts are such that word occurs. And it turns out that negative log probability, for a word like yonder and a word like aback, they occur in extremely predictable context. Here, it's not the best measure of context. This is just a really simplistic measure of context, which is just taking strings of words that we can get from huge texts very easily. It's not the right way to measure context. I mean, whatever the right is, it's just a very simple measure of context, which is the preceding two words. And the reason we use that is that we can use texts that various companies, well, most notably Google, have assembled. And so back in 2009, they released these corpora of n-grams, which are just sequences of 2, 3, and 4 words across many, many languages. I guess it was 11 languages at that time. We can look, and then we could look for this relationship. We could look for the relationship between the predictability of a word given the previous two words, for example, and that predictability, and correlate that with the length of the word. And it turns out there's a very strong relationship, and it's a better relationship than just frequency independent of context. That word length frequency relationship is there. It's strong, but there's a much stronger relationship, which is between the predictability of a and the length. And so that's true in all the languages that we looked at then and all the languages that anyone's looked at since. So there does seem to be this generalization. So the Zipfian one is right, this George Zip one is right, that word length is related to word frequency, but there's a better version of that, which is like, oh, it's not just predictability, independent of context. It's actually predictability in context is driving that more specifically. It's a better predictor of word length.
And so,
yeah, go ahead.
So from a design perspective, what you're arguing is that languages have used these types of heuristics. It's not specific to one language, but you see it across languages.
That's right. And you see it, I mean, we probably, that's hard to explore in sort of language change as it's happening. We kind of suspect it's happening in that, when a word comes into a language, if a word gets used a lot, it tends to get shortened if it's being used a lot. So words like, the original concept of moving picture turning into movie, turning into something short. Words like, originally the word associated with an car was an automobile, and that got shortened down to car, and I'm not actually sure about the history. So when things come in, so I guess people talked about electronic mail originally, and that got shortened to email. And there were whenever we use something in modern technology, if we use it a lot, then there's a strong tendency, if it's being used a lot, to want to shorten that those words. And we can explore that in there are sort of a bunch of words out there which mean the same thing, and it still exists in the language. Things like math and mathematics kind of mean the same thing. There's a lot of these, not that many, but there's around 50 of these words in English, which are sort of one's a short form of the other. And then we can look at the relationship of the usage of one of those words, of each of those words, and the context in which they get used. And it turns out that a word like math gets used in a context where it's more predictable than a word like mathematics, where basically the contexts are more unpredictable around a word like mathematics than a word like math. So there's other math-related words around the word math typically than for mathematics, where that will typically be brought in out of the blue in some sense.
And so if I understand that correctly, Ted, the idea there is that if you have high predictability, there is lower risk of miscommunication by using shorter form, right? So you have another heuristic here, the partitioning of semantic space. What exactly does that mean?
Well, what we intended there was, we're talking about not only form. Okay, so this is all. So the first part here is just about form, right? So it's like when something gets used a lot, we like to make it easier for ourselves. We try to make things short. So that's like an easy way to make things so if we can say less. Now, there's a whole other question about efficiency of what exactly are we talking about in the world, and so that's what we're talking about, semantic space. What are we talking about in the world, and how do we invent names for things? Like why are there words at all, right? So, and there's different kinds of ideas about why that might be. And from the communication perspective for why there are words, it's because I want to communicate something to you. I want to tell you something. Okay, so there's a different, so that may seem like kind of obvious and maybe the only way you can think about it initially, but let's make it concrete and talk about a particular semantic space. And so there's several of these that have been explored in some depth, but the one that's been explored in most depth around the world's languages is the domain of color and color language. It's what I mean by that is just the words that people have for different colors in a language. And so in English and in all industrialized culture languages, there will be at least 11 words that everyone knows, and those are black, white, let me go through them, red, green, yellow, blue, brown, pink, orange, purple, and gray. Everyone will know those 11 words in English, and there's going to be some corresponding set of at least 11 terms in all industrialized cultures. But very interestingly, in non-industrialized cultures, in cultures like hunter-gatherers or farmer-foragers, there are many fewer words that the population will know, and so down to as few as two, as only having words for black and white, basically, but often only having 3, 4, or 5 terms, say black, white, and red, or some other combination. Always black and white, at least black and white, and then always red is the third. But after that, it gets kind of noisy and a little confusing as to exactly what's going on there. And so the standard claim actually in the literature is not a communication one. The standard claim in the literature is having to do with something about the way that visual space works, the way that sight works for color, such that when cultures are developing, in some sense, they, for some reason, don't want to. The color words that they bring into the language are the ones that they can see most easily. Is the idea? That's a very different idea than communication. The communication idea has to do with why do I invent a word for red, for the concept red, for example, the reason I invent that word is that I have maybe 2 objects and they're identical except for that feature of color, and I want to tell you which one it is. It's the red one, not the black one, or the red one, not the green one, right? So I need to, so that's the communication-based idea. And so then the reason then maybe that in non-industrialized cultures they have fewer words for colors may have to do with the kinds of objects that they typically interact with. And in industrialized cultures, it's very easy. I mean, it's very easy to see why we need words for colors in industrialized cultures, because we make things. And if I'm looking around my office right now, everything in my office, with the exception of myself and my dog, are industrialized things and are arbitrarily colored. We have dyes that can make everything here any color we want. And so, if I have 2 shirts in the closet, at some point I bought them at a store, and I could have picked from a range of colors. I need words to tell me which one I want of those objects. Now, if you go to a non-industrialized culture, so I work with a couple of indigenous tribes in the Amazon, one in Bolivia, one in Brazil, but the Bolivian one is one I work with most on color. It's called the Chamani. That group doesn't have lots of objects which are industrialized. They have hardly any. They have very, very few. I mean, they do have a few, but they mostly have stuff they make on their own. Many of their tools are handmade. They make them themselves from the materials that are available to them. And their houses are all built by themselves by the materials that are available in the local environment. The clothing is typically industrialized. It's mostly industrialized stuff, but it's stuff that they've just got one of each time. They didn't get choices of those things. And so this language has very few words for color. It does have black, white, and red, and it has some variability across the rest. And so the idea here is try to figure out why cultures vary so much. The communication idea offers a potential reason as to why they might vary, is because they don't need to talk about color. They don't have multiple objects which are identical. And so they don't. This word is just not very useful in that culture, and so it's not really invented. It's not something that they use. And so what we did, one of the things I did there was to look at, why it is. We're trying to understand why it is words for colors look the way they do across the world's languages. And so we started, we're not the first. There's a bunch of people who have done information theory kind of ways. We just kind of used the stuff that was out there. And a way to think about this is like, in information theory terms, we can talk about the number of bits of information it takes to convey a particular color. Okay, and the way to think about that, a way to think about that is, say I've got a bunch of colors that I'm selecting among. If you have normal vision, you can see literally millions of different colors. You can tell the difference between millions of different colors. And so we don't have words for all of those, right? So we only have, maybe we have 11 words in English, but maybe a few more than 11, right? Most people know more than 11 words for colors in English, but maybe 20 or 30. It's still a tiny subset of what you can distinguish using your visual system. And so let's select some smaller subset of colors to distinguish. And so what people have done who do research on color language is take some subset of the most distinguishable colors that can be seen in any language, just be seen perceptually. And so there's like a subset, a big set of language of colors that people have used. We used a subset. When I've done this work, we've used a subset of what they did. So they started with 330 of them, and we cut that down to around 80. So just because it takes a very long time to run the tasks that you need to run. So basically, if you're asking, the task is to take these 330 or in our case 84 colors and ask people to label each one of them. It's a hard task. It's a slow task among people that don't talk about color very much. And so it takes a very long time to even do this for 84. It takes maybe 45 minutes or an hour. It's not very exciting. I can't imagine how long it takes. I didn't run the 331 on our group. This group is the group that I work with. The Chimani don't have, it's kind of low on the scale of information theoretic language evolution for color terms. Anyway, so you can basically figure out how easy it is to convey a particular color from me to you, for example, by an information theoretic term, which is basically the number of guesses, the number of bits it takes you to figure out which color I meant given the word that I used. Okay, so I'm allowed to use a word to do this. So maybe I choose some shade of green, and so I say green, and then that's what I'm kind of stuck with. English or whatever. Maybe I use some other more complicated term. Maybe I say olive or something. If I know a particular green I'm thinking of here. And then the way we decide information theoretically is how many bits on average it might take to communicate will depend on how variable people are in labeling that particular color. That's like the probability of a word given a color. And so if it's a particular color that people are very reliably labeled the same way all the time, then there's not that's good. That's easy. That's good for the information theory. But a lot of times, if things are on the boundary, there's going to be some probability distribution shifted around, among different terms for that particular color. And more critically, actually, on the other side, so you as the listener, when you hear a word, which color do you think it is plays a big role in how easy it is to convey that color. So if I say green to you, and then we look at the color space and decide among that color space, which of those greens did I mean given I said that word, it turns out there's a lot of things in the color space that even in the 80 sets of colors that we have, there's a bunch of them that it could have been. There's a bunch of things that an English speaker might have said are called green. And so that makes it worse. It makes it a little worse at conveying that color to you. It takes more bits to convey that. Now, if you compare that to actually red, for example, red is like in a space in the English and in every language, it turns out, where it's more narrowly defined. So there's fewer distractors of other things that would be called red in and around there. And we were defining the space, the color space, purely perceptually. So we define the space in terms of what physical colors look similar to one another. And it turns out that there are fewer things around that everyone would agree calling red, even though we can distinguish them. There are fewer of them relative to the ones that we would call green or blue, for example. There's many, many more things that we were called green or blue, which we can perceptually distinguish. So the color space around green and blue is much bigger than around red. And that's what we ended up observing across every language. Turns out that every single language puts more words in the so-called warm part of the color space, the red, orange, yellow, brown, pink part. There's a bunch of words there in English where we put in the warm space, and in the cool space, blue and green, there's like two words. It's kind of the same size of what we can distinguish perceptually, and yet there's many, many fewer words there. And so that's like the way that languages put words in the color space turns out to be very asymmetric, and putting way more words in the warm than the cool. And then we figured out that, oh, that's maybe due to the things that we want to talk about, and those are objects. We want to talk about people, we want to talk about animals, we want to talk about berries, originally, things, fruits and berries. These things tend to be warm colored and not cool colored. And the way we can most easily see that is that cool colored, what does that even mean? That means the sky, that means, the blue sky, the water, the trees, the grass, all this green stuff. This is stuff we don't really want to talk about. This is background for our objects. Objects tend to be warm colored relative to cool colored backgrounds. And in fact, this is the first actually technical definition of what it even means for something to be warm or cool colored. This is like objects are warm colored and backgrounds are cool colored. And we can measure that using databases of objects against backgrounds. And we can see that there's a very strong relationship between what's an object and whether it's so-called warm colored or cool colored. And that happens to be true. And so we measured this in a few languages ourselves, but there was this giant database of 110 languages, which doing this World Color Survey, which these guys, Brent Berlin and Paul Kay, collected back in the 90s. And it's available at Berkeley on the Berkeley website. It has data from around 30 speakers from each of 110 languages, each one of which is a non-industrialized language from every part of the world. And there's the same relationship in every single one of them, such that warm colors are easier to convey than cool colors. So that's a true linguistic universal, that warm colors are easier to convey than cool colors. And we think that's probably due to people developing these languages to talk about objects and not talk about, they don't want to talk about the background.
So this is another sort of universal heuristic that you find, that warm colors, you communicate with fewer bits. It's more clear. It's more easily communicated. And the hypothesis that that is what people generally use because they're talking about objects, not about backgrounds. And the cool colors tend to be in the background. So that's another interesting. So this again provides additional force toward, there is a design template that all languages seem to be using, and they tend to be universal. There's a third one here, syntax. Now, syntax is a general term for how sentences are put together, right? And there again, we find some very interesting similarities across languages.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, these are like, we basically explore any areas of sort of meaning, language meaning, where we can look for similarities and differences. And so, in this, so each of the first two cases, these are like form of the words, and now the meanings of the words. That's the the color example. And then this third case is like compositionality of how the words get put together in their so-called syntax across languages. And here, I mean, we were just kind of exploring, again, each one of these cases, we were basically exploring ways in which languages might be similar or different. It's a kind of we're just taking a kind of computer science, information theoretic, really computer science generally approach to studying human language. And so that is basically taking big databases of language, whatever forms, however that's been processed, and try to look for generalizations there. And so in the form of syntax, what we did was take the so-called dependency structures from many languages. And so here what's happened is there's something called the Universal Dependency Tree Bank or corpora, which a bunch of researchers in language researchers, computer scientists who want to do things like automatic translation from one language to another. And they've gone and so-called parsed, basically structured by hand, many sentences from many languages. And so we had access to 37 languages originally. And so what this means is, so you take a sentence, like any sentence in any language, we're working in English here, I'll say, I was talking the cat earlier. So the cat chases the mouse is a very simple sentence in English. And there's a dependency structure in that very simple sentence such that the depends on cat, and the cat, that whole noun phrase, depends on chases for its meaning. Basically, the cat is the agent here of chasing. And the same thing on for the so-called object here, the mouse, the goes to mouse, and mouse is dependent on chase again. And there's some and there's like discussions and arguments in the literature about what the phrase structure, if there's a phrase structure associated with that sentence is. But the dependency structure is those words, like you basically throw or through there is what the sentence is about in some sense. Is like it's a throwing event, and the agent of that is the cat, and the patient of that is the mouse. And so there's some relationship there such that cat depends on through and mouse depends on through, and the two thes depend on each of their heads there. That's the dependency structure. And we're doing that for when you're listening to me, you are computing a dependency structure, implicitly in your head for all the sentences that I'm saying. And we can do that. It's actually pretty easy to figure out the dependency structure for any sentence in English. There are some cases which are a little bit difficult, but in any language, actually, it's not too hard to figure out a formalism for figuring out, which things depend on which. It's like pretty much figuring out what the predicate argument meaning of a sentence is, and you can do that pretty easily, in a language. And so these people have done that for gone through a big corpus of English, a big corpus of 36 other languages that which they measured here. So from Danish to Dutch to Greek, modern Greek, and ancient Greek, actually Spanish, Swedish, Tamil, lots of languages here were explored in their original data set that we were looking at across, I think, 10 different families. But so most of them are Indo-European languages because that's mostly what's available. People want to translate, for example, but there's 9 other families that were represented here. And we were interested in some generalizations in how these languages look. And one of the things we were looking at was whether the dependencies between words were tended to be relatively close to one another. There's an observation in the psychology of language literature such that dependency structures that are kind of close together tend to be easier to be processed. So, there's an example which I use as a joke is like, here's an example of a translation of a sign that was in on a Russian cemetery. It says, you can visit the cemetery where famous Russian composers are buried daily except Thursday. That was a sign that was on this burial area. And the idea here is that when you hear or read buried daily except Thursday, you think, oh, daily except Thursday probably goes locally with buried, and that's crazy. The intention here, of course, is the visiting. Yeah. You can visit the cemetery could be taking place daily except Thursday. So you could reword that. So you can visit daily except Thursday the cemetery, something like that. You could do that. Or you visit the cemetery, daily except Thursday, where Russian composers are buried. You could have reworded that in a way such that there wasn't this temporary ambiguity. I mean, these were non-English speakers translating this, and so when you read this in English, it just sounds silly. It sounds funny, and that's probably because when we read or when we process language, we tend to have a locality bias. We like to put words, we like to connect things together to the more local thing and the less local thing. And so that was what we were kind of looking for in the world's languages. Do languages, not just in ambiguity situations like that, but in their structures overall, independent of ambiguity, tend to like local structures over non-local structures. And so what we did there to test that idea was take a sentence from English, just as an example. This is going to be true in every language. So I took the cat chases the mouse again, okay? And that's got chase as its head for the whole sentence there. And then what this was a project led by a guy called Richard Futrell, who was a student in my lab, and now he's a professor down in University of California in Irvine. And so what he did was take the head of each sentence, so in that case it'd be chases, and chases there has two dependents. It has cat and mouse as its dependents. So there's like a ternary structure there at the top of that tree, of that phrase structure. And what he just did was like, let's just scramble that in some random order. And so this is how English happens to phrase that meaning. Let's see how some other language, a random other language, you might randomly order these things, might do that. And do that, so to take some random order of those three elements. And then do that scrambling all the way down this dependency structure. So then do it for the cat and the mouse. There's only three things to do in this very simple sentence. And you just go all the way down the tree. And then he would do that 100 times for every sentence in each language. And then look at the dependency distances between the words for the ones that actually occurred in the real languages and compare them to these baselines, which are kind of like some other way that this might have happened in some random language conveying the same meaning. And what he found was that every single language, and then it was further constrained, actually, a little bit more constrained than that, so that you disallow crossed dependencies in your random structures. You don't allow, it turns out if you allow cross dependencies, then dependencies get really long, really fast for longer sentences. So that's, he's actually constrained it. That's, there's a hypothesis out there that maybe the reason that languages disallow cross dependencies is in fact to maybe keep dependencies local. That's like due to a guy called Ramon Ferreri Concho, who's a Spanish information theorist working on language. And so he guesses that maybe the reason that languages don't allow cross dependencies for the most part is because they're trying to keep dependencies close. We were looking at even, like, let's assume he's right, that we don't allow cross dependencies. Yeah. Even so, dependencies in every language are closer together than we would expect compared to this random baseline. They're not quite at the optimal level, so they're not down to the absolute optimal, and that's because there are rules. There are grammatical rules within every language, and we need to follow those. Presumably those rules are there to make language easier to learn. So there's some trade-off here between learnability, making things general and easy to learn, and keeping dependencies close together. There's some trade-off here. But all languages are below that baseline, and so this is true, for example, for not just for these cases of ambiguity where you choose a local connection over a non-local, but it's also like, so there are these neat generalizations across languages such that if a language happens to be verb initial. English isn't verb initial, but it's right after, it's only after the subject, the agents come first, and then everything else comes after the verb after that. If it's like that, then you also have so-called prepositions, these words that come before their noun. So I say, I gave a book to Mary. I don't say I gave a book Mary to. The to comes before Mary, not after. As a preposition. And English also has there's something called these subordinate clause markers. These are words like that. I think that Mary is brilliant or something. So the word that is marking a clause which is subordinate to the main clause, which is a lower clause, and that comes before the subordinate clause, not after it. The reason I'm bringing these up is that in languages which are so-called verb final, so a language like Japanese or Korean or Turkish, these languages have they're verb final, so that the verbs come at the end of everything. You have postpositions. You don't say I gave a book to Mary. You say I gave a book Mary to. Actually, it's like I book Mary to gave. Okay, gave comes at the end, right? And it's Mary to. There's a marker at the end of that, not at the beginning. And in these verb final languages, you also have the subordinate clause marker comes after. And it turns out that having that systematic order, such that you have prepositions with verb before and you have postpositions with verb after, that minimizes dependency lengths. And that's what you see across languages, is these neat correlations between the ways that structures are and their dependency lengths.
Yeah, so you say, so there are three most common orders, subject, verb, object.
Yeah.
So that is SVO. That is English, right? There is SOV and there is VSO. Either one of those would be sort of difficult, I would imagine, for an English speaker. But it's interesting that you say that if you were to do pure optimization on distances, there is some trade-off to learnability. And so is it true that languages sort of trading off learnability to pure optimum precision?
We don't know that. And so this is like, you know, these examples I've given you, you know, we're going through in your podcast, you were going through some of the examples of ways in which we think language looks like it's built for communication or for ease of transmission in some sense, right? But there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So these are like sort of test cases which show that there is a relationship between sort of some levels of simplicity in language structure, but there's like a lot of work that needs to be done to figure out, you know, because there's a lot of things that haven't been figured out there. So what is the relationship between learnability and communication? These things are very different, right? They're very different pressures on a system. The ease of very different from the ease of something to communicate. These are like going on actually kind of in the opposite direction in many cases. And so, you know, figuring out how those things work together is a, you know, a promissory note in this kind of, at this point in the state of research, and at this point in research on this field. And so, yes, there's you know, we can point out that there's just these, you know, the fact that we're not at the baseline means it's not optimized, like perfectly optimized for dependency length minimization, right? At all, it isn't. And then why isn't it at the baseline? Well, that's probably because of regularities that are probably easier to learn, but then those details have to be spelled out in models and figure out what exactly those are. And then you were asking questions about these three. It's true. There are, so if you took things like, we take sort of the most basic types of events that we might want to transmit as subjects, verbs, and objects, I don't think that's really true. And so, but that has been a hypothesis. Like, so I'm not the one that started that, and this has been going on in the field of linguistics for a long time. People talk about basic word order among things like the cat chases the mouse. Okay, where you've got a cat, which is an agent, some of some event, which is a chasing event, and there's a patient. You know, it's not like that's the most. I mean, the implicit claim is that something that may be the most common kind of event or something, and we might want to know how that event is structured in any language. In fact, it's like a lot of different kinds of events which don't really fit that framework in some ways. But so that's how it's been framed. People in the history of studying language have started looking at just orders of subjects, verbs, and objects. And it's true. There's an observation is that the subjects tend to occur before objects. And so that's why you get these three word orders, which are super common. S, V, O, so that's S is before O. S, O, V, S is again before O. And V, S, O. And so S is again before O. The other three, which are logically possible scramblings of those things, are just relatively rarer. So VOS, OVS, and OSV are all very rare in the world's languages, and some of them have been argued not to exist at all. But I think VOS is a real thing, for example. But I'm not sure about the other two. The other two might be. I mean, I've been told that OVS is a real thing also. But I'm not sure about OSV, for instance. So OSV may just be a variant of, may just be SOV. And so, I mean, this is just, you know, discussions. The difficulty in knowing this is like the most common languages in the world aren't any of those. And so there's not very many speakers. I mean, that's not true about VOS. So VOS, like Malagasy, I think, is a VOS language, and there's like a couple million speakers of this language. And so it's like, okay, there are examples of common word languages, like languages which we can get a lot of access to a lot of speakers of, who speak at least a VOS language. The others are just happen to be languages for which there's just not a lot of speakers who we can get easy access to. And so they may or may not be real, they may not be. And so now your question is, I mean, the question is like, there's like interesting observations that, first of all, like why is S4O such a common generalization? And that's an old observation due to Joseph Greenberg and others maybe before him. In fact, he's a famous typologist from like language, person who studied a lot of different languages, who was at Stanford in the, I guess, 50s, 60s, 70s. And, his observation, I guess the hypothesis there has to do with the reason that subjects, which are the agents, come before objects is probably about the speaker. Like these are all, human, languages, and we want to talk about ourselves. We want to talk about the agent of something is more important in an event than the objects, the things that are happening to them. That's right. What is a subject is typically an agent, and that's me. I'm doing something, and I want to tell you what I'm doing, or I want to know what are the animals doing or something, as opposed to how it's being affected. What's happening to, what am I doing? I'm kicking the ball or something. The ball is less important to me than the person who's doing the kicking. And so that's maybe why those things come first in across the world's languages mostly. But I mean, then it's not always true. And so that's like, at least there are these VOS examples, which are exceptions. And the understanding the range of exceptions is going to be important also to understanding what's really going on here. But we don't know that at this point.
Excellent. This has been great. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.